Welcome back, everybody. God bless. I'm going to start all that over because I'm recording. This is St. Mary's Adult Catechism. We're covering the sacrament of holy matrimony this week. And because of that, I'm recording this for some of our engaged couples who are going to want to watch this and benefit from it as well as part of our premarital education program at St. Mary's. This class this week will probably be a two-parter as well. I have enough material that I probably won't finish in our usual hour and a half slot, which is fine. We'll probably talk mostly about the biblical and canonical understanding of marriage today, some of the kind of the moral, ethical, cultural dynamics and issues that go with marriage. And then next week we'll get into the crunchiness of the rite itself, of the actual wedding service itself, and I'll give you a little kind of a tour of what that is like. So let's get into it. I'm going to share with you our handy dandy screen. Let's start at the top. Dun, dun, dun. Shall we make it a full slideshow? Why not? Again, originally these were based on the lectures by Father Josiah Trenham. I've done a lot of reworking on this, though, so there's a lot of material that's not in that. However, if you would like to listen to his lecture as a supplement, you're certainly welcome. Okay, so Father Josiah at least started with the question of why did God institute marriage? He put these in terms of unity, complementarity, fidelity, holy companionship. We'll look at that from the book of Genesis. It's not good for us to be alone. Also for the procreation of children, that is a primary purpose of marriage, but not necessarily the only purpose of marriage. And also the overcoming of sin, the yoking of our desires and our selfish ways to a life in which we have to now be accountable to another and live not just for ourselves, but for a spouse, for children that come out of that marriage. So not just the overcoming of sin in the sense of like the lust of the flesh and wanting to fornicate, but really all of the passions, learning humility, learning generosity, learning patience, learning forgiveness, all the aspects that we are needing to overcome sin in our life. Marriage becomes a powerful path for how to do that. It's not the only path, but it is certainly a path of salvation, as we say in the church. Okay, so just like most things, we go back to the beginning, and in particular with the sacrament of matrimony, we don't have so much of words of institution like we say we do in things like the Eucharist, for example, or confession, or the forgiving of sins, and so forth. Because marriage is such a primary relationship in human life, and in animal life, for that matter, for the question of mating. But nonetheless, we do have a spiritual dimension to it, and we look at the first human beings as the model, actually, of the origins of marriage. The first marriage is Adam and Eve. Humanity was created in such a way that they came into the world wed, if you will. So in Genesis chapter 2, we read that God said, "Let us make man in our image according to our likeness, to have dominion over the creatures of the earth." And verse 27, "So God made man in the image of God. He made him male and female. He made them." So we were created with this biological polarity for the sake of procreation, just as most mammals, all mammals are. Then God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion." This idea of dominion should not be interpreted in terms of some kind of reckless, lording over the earth, but rather dominion as in you are responsible. You are the caretakers. You are the stewards of this creation, which I created. You didn't create it. It doesn't belong to you, but you have dominion. You are given the authority to manage it. That's our proper relationship to the earth. So when we talk about stewardship in the church, most people think that's about giving money to the church. That's a fundraising idea. It is that in some respects, but it's way more than that. Stewardship is our primary function in creation itself, and our expression of stewardship in the church is just one particular expression of how we manage the gifts that God has given us. And God saw everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good. It's really important. God sees all the things he creates in Genesis, and after every one he sees, he says, and God saw that it was good. And it's only after he creates humanity in his image and likeness and gives them dominion and then looks over everything, he says, indeed, it was very good. So there's something about the creation of humanity that for God was kind of the crowning achievement of creation. This being who was both visible and invisible, both flesh and spirit, both animal and angel, if you will, that has this quality that is in the image and likeness of God, that is the apex of creation. Yet somehow things don't always go right. This is an interesting icon I included, by the way. I'm joined today by Preachasa Stephanie, who is my co-celebrant in the nuptial priesthood of life. So if you want to come sit on camera with me, sweetie. This icon's kind of neat because this says, the Greek there is, and he made them in his image and likeness. And you'll notice that it's the let us. So it's three angelic figures depicting the Holy Trinity, which is a rare kind of icon. Welcome, Preachasa. How are you? Yes, sorry. A lot of marriages scooting over, I have found. Simple. Okay, so what happens? The Lord, now, what's interesting, if you actually have looked closely at Genesis, there's multiple creation stories in Genesis. It's not just one creation story. There is that first creation story, which kind of lays out the whole cosmos, and it just kind of summarizes God created male and female. But then we get the next version of it in which we have the paradise, and Adam is there, but the creatures and the plants haven't even come up, and then God breathes into him and makes him a living spirit. And then this is what we read in Genesis 3. The Lord God said, it is not good for man to be alone. So this is another one of these primary ideas of our spiritual tradition. We are not meant to live for ourselves. We are not self-sufficient beings. We are meant to live in communion with others. And so God says, I will make him a helper, a helpmate comparable to him, not a servant, a helpmate, somebody who will be on par with him, somebody that will assist him in his role of steward of creation, right? Taking care of all the things. And it talks about how God created all the animals, presented the animals to Adam. Adam names them, but finds nothing comparable to him, no one to be equal to. So God brought a trance upon Adam, and he slept. And he took one of his ribs and filled up the flesh in its place. The Lord God built the rib he took from Adam into a woman and brought her to him. And Adam said, this is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of man. And then it says, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and shall be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. And the two were naked, both Adam and his wife, and they were not ashamed. There's a lot to talk about in this. The symbolism here, of course, is we're going to, just to be a little preemptive to a future slide, is that this itself is a foreshadowing of the church. That when Christ dies on the cross and they pierce his side with a spear, out from his rib comes blood and water, and that signifies the church. So while Christ, who is the second Adam, is in his deep trance, the trance of death upon the cross, the church is being formed by God through the mystery of salvation. And then Christ is the bridegroom of the church, who can say to the church, behold, this is flesh of my flesh and bone of my bones. This is one body with me. And that's the principles of ecclesiology. If you were in the class in the first semester, so to speak, we talked about ecclesiology. This is connected to that as well through that line, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. Usually we think of it the other way. In most traditional societies we've seen, the wife leaves her father and mother and goes and joins herself to the husband's household. So this is actually kind of a reversal of many of these traditional patterns. And Christ himself, so to speak, leaves the bosom of the Father so that he can join himself to his wife and become one flesh with her when he descends on earth. So there's some symbolism in that as well. And the two were naked, both Adam and his wife, and were not ashamed. They were naked, but they were not naked. What do I mean by that? They were naked in the sense that they didn't have any clothes on, but they were also clothed with honor and glory because they were made in the image and likeness of God. They were clothed with the innocence of paradise. They were clothed with the grace and the life of a blessed existence, which when they lose, then they finally realize, oh, we're really naked now. And then they're ashamed, right? And they hide themselves in the fall. And this is an interesting icon which depicts them in their nakedness, now wrapped and clothed instead of glory, but entwined in the skin of the serpent, which I thought was a very interesting icon from the country of Georgia. And what happens in the fall then is the human relationships that were primordial between Adam and Eve, that naked and unashamed, that purely innocent, that grace-filled life has become broken, distorted, wounded, poisoned, whatever you want to call it, diseased. And the relationships begin to suffer. And the root of all human dysfunction comes out of essentially this concept of the fall. And so the Lord, when he describes to them the consequences of the fall, we usually, from a kind of a Sunday school mindset, we would say, oh, God was punishing them with these. But God is simply stating the consequences of what will now life be like in this fallen state. For example, the Lord says, I will greatly multiply your sorrow and your conception. In pain you shall bring forth children. Your desire shall be toward or for your husband, and he shall rule over you. Is not God saying, this is what I want for you? This is what the consequences are of the fall. And to Adam he said, because you heeded the voice of your wife and ate from the tree of which I commanded you, saying, you shall not eat from it, cursed is the ground in your labors. In toil you shall eat from it all the days of your life. And this is not to say you should never listen to your wife. God forbid. Of course not. She is the helpmate who is made comparable to him. She has a very specific role to be a person that you would want to listen to if you're the husband. The problem here is that he listened to her when it went contrary to the command of God, right? You listened to her and you didn't listen to me. There is a priority of obedience in our lives, and both husbands and wives are called to obey God first. Now, what's interesting is that, Eve wasn't actually necessarily disobeying God. She wasn't the one who was given the commandment, right? The Lord gave that to Adam. And, you could say that the fullness of the fall, Adam blames Eve, as we see in the hymns of the church from last Sunday. You see that he says, when the Lord asks him, what have you done? He says, the woman that you gave me. He not only blames her, but he in essence blames God for what happened, because you gave me this woman and she did this thing. Now I did this thing and it's not really my fault, is what he's saying, right? But that's not the case at all. We have to follow the command of God. That's our primary relationship. Nonetheless, he suffers because of his activity. His relationship not only to his wife is distorted, but in fact his relationship to the very earth is distorted. Both thorns and thistles it shall bring forth from you, and you shall, in the sweat of your face, you shall eat bread till you return to the ground from which you were taken. You will no longer live in paradise, able to live eternally, eating from the tree of life. You will live a mortal life, a life which will be plagued by toil and trouble and sorrow and eventually death itself. And so Adam called his wife's name life, actually. In the Greek Septuagint, they translate the Hebrew name of Eva literally because it means life. And so in Greek, it's Zoe. And so in this translation, it translates the Greek. Adam called his wife's name Life because she was the mother of all living. So she's not to be blamed for the cause of all this death. That's Adam's fault, but she actually becomes the source of life for all living things. That's why we still love to name our daughters Eva and Zoe and things like that. She's not a bad person that needs to be cursed over history. All right, Adam's the guy who botched it here. All right, but you may say, but Father, what about polygamy? Nobody's ever actually said that to me. But where does polygamy come from, for example? Because there will some people say, well, you can't listen to the Bible to teach you about marriage because there was all this polygamy and we don't approve of that. So that's hypocritical to demand people to follow some biblical. Well, the biblical rule is never saying polygamy is good. Let's first establish that. In fact, it's quite the opposite. The very first polygamist that we know of at least, was the murderer Lamech. Lamech was like the great grandson of Cain. And while Cain murdered his brother, Lamech was the first kind of multi-murderer. He killed two men apparently, and he took for himself two wives. The name of one was Ada, whose name means adornment, and the second was named Zillah, not from Godzilla, but from Hebrew Tselah, which means shadow. She might have been a bridezilla, I don't know, but she was the second wife, so I wouldn't blame her because she's already in a difficult situation. So. And then you see this kind of that becomes a thing that basically the pagans do, if you will, or those who are following the line of Cain, the ones who are not being faithful to God. But we see that up until the time of Abraham, then Abraham's, even though he's the father of the faith, right, so to speak, he also has marriage problems. He is not able to have a child with Sarah, so he tries this whole thing with her maidservant, the handmaid Hagar. That's The Handmaid's Tale, and all that comes from all that stuff. That is by no means being presented as a great idea, right, or as a solution for society. It is a source of problems in their relationship. It's a source of contention between Hagar and Sarah, and then other concubines and things like that. So the whole idea of concubinage enters into the mix, and that's not a pretty picture. You see the same thing with Jacob and Esau. Jacob has to labor incessantly for his uncle Laban so that he can win the bride of his choice, which was Rachel, after being given Leah first, right? So, and that causes all kinds of stress and troubles. Then you really see it blowing up on people in the story of David and Solomon, right? David, in his lustful ways, commits adultery with the wife of Uriah, and out of that comes his child Solomon, and Solomon has many wives, and both of their extramarital and multimarital relationships are a cause of instability and chaos and civil war within their kingdoms. So it's by no means a recipe for success. So when Christ comes as the bridegroom of the church, he presents himself and as the bridegroom of the church, a strict monogamist, and teaches strict monogamy for us as the original paradisical model for human relationships. He abolishes polygamy. The church has never supported polygamy as an acceptable form in Christianity. The first group to ever try that, of course, are the Mormons, and they're notorious for it. And there are, of course, still certain fringe fundamentalist LDS groups in this country that will still practice it, unfortunately. But it's considered to be a destructive pattern and not one that God originally intended. So, what's the chat here? Oh, Cindy had a power outage. Sorry, Cindy. So the Lord found us upside down with our flesh dominating our spirits. I assume this is a quote from Father Josiah that we kept. And so Christ comes to fix that which was broken in Adam and reverse the effects of the fall. We talked about this in Hey, well, so what class. We talked about this in the Saving Work of Christ class in the last semester and so forth. Christ restores the creation to its original functionality, basically, and restores humanity to its original dignity. And that includes marriage as well. Marriage, which had been suffering all this problems, throughout the Old Testament and so forth. Marriage is brought to a new level, actually, in the new covenant. It's restored to a much higher state than it was even under Moses. And so we read in Hebrews chapter 13, the marriage is honorable among all, and the bed undefiled, but fornicators and adulterers God will judge. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we go today. Part of it is that adultery is infidelity, unfaithfulness, and therefore it is an image of our relationship to God. The ultimate sin is not adultery, though most wives and husbands who have suffered it will say that absolutely is the worst I've ever suffered. But it actually pales in comparison to the ultimate sin of infidelity to God and apostasy to God. If one destroys a marriage, the other destroys an immortal soul, and therefore they're closely united. They're still of the deadly sins, right? There's really the three ultimate sins in the early church were adultery, apostasy, and murder. Okay. Now this is Ephesians chapter 5. I don't want to read the whole thing to you. You can see it there as I'm talking. This is the epistle reading for the wedding service. And you'll see that it draws out some of what we've been talking about here. And it's really a difficult one with the modern times, because the first line is like a record scratching across, and when people hear it, because it's so dated and so just, not with the times. Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. You want me to do what? You want me to do what? What's that for?
That's what women do in church when they hear that.
Yeah, like they're making some statement of empowerment, to instead of understanding the context here. Because if you look further, you'll see why he's saying what he's saying. First of all, like 2 lines before this, and some liturgical versions of the wedding service were wise enough to include like the previous 2 verses in Ephesians, which say Christians submit to one another in all humility, so that you understand that submitting to one another is actually a Christian duty for all Christians, first of all. So it's not an evil thing that one group is being asked to do. But he's saying the husband is the head of the wife as Christ is the head of the church and the Savior of the body. Just as the church is subject to Christ, so let the wives be to their own husbands in everything. This implies a reciprocal form of service on the part of the husband. The husband loves his wife as Christ loves the church and gave himself for her, the next verse. So if the woman has to, respect and submit and subject her will to her husband in some form, the husband in return submits his whole life, his very life essence in the service of his spouse, sacrificing himself for her, to lift her up, to sanctify her, to bless her. This is the message of the cross. This is not the message of lordship. Say, and you rule over your wives, as a benevolent ruler. That would be what a lot of men would like to hear, but that's not what they're actually being told by St. Paul. They're being told that you have to be ready to give your life, and that you must do everything in your power to lift her up and present her before God. So you have this extraordinary responsibility of self-sacrifice as a husband. The woman also has a responsible opportunity and responsibility for a self-sacrifice in her love for her husband. And then he also reiterates here, verses 30 and 31 there, the same Genesis-based ideas that we saw. We are members of the Lord's body, of his flesh and of his bones. When he sees us, he says, you are flesh of my flesh and bone of my bones. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife. So the husband has to protect his wife. He has to prefer his wife. He has to show all that deference to her honor, and to never put her in a position that would besmirch her. He has to stand between her and the in-laws and all those things. So if he doesn't do that, he is not doing the job that husband entails from a Christian perspective. And St. Paul then concludes, this is a great mystery. And remember, this is the same word that we use for the word sacrament. This is, so you could say, this is a great sacrament, marriage. But I speak concerning Christ and the church. So all of what marriage is simply an icon and an image of what the true heavenly reality of our relationship to God is meant to be. And it should model the heavenly kingdom relationship. It should be a model of Christ and his church. Nevertheless, he says, and it's moderated here at the end, nevertheless, let each one of you in particular so love his own wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. So you kind of get down to it. It's a much more balanced way of looking at it. It is a hierarchical relationship in marriages, and that's the order of the old ancient world, and in many cases still in many parts of the world. And some people are okay with that, and some people are not. But it is definitely a hierarchy of servant leadership and self-sacrifice. The higher up the ladder of leadership you go in the church, the more sacrifice you are being asked to make for others. It's not a kind of an earthly, worldly lordship. And the icon here is what we call the Onymphos, the bridegroom icon. We bring it out during Holy Week, and we have the bridegroom matins in which we hear some of the hymnography and the gospel readings about this concept of Christ the bridegroom. So this is what the bridegroom is supposed to be. He's not a tyrant. He is the suffering Lord of glory who gives himself for the sake of his beloved. What a beautiful image. So St. Tikhon, following this in pastoral advice, St. Tikhon, you may not have ever heard of St. Tikhon of Zadansky. He's a kind of a lesser-known Russian hierarch saint, but he was influential in this country because St. Patriarch Tikhon, it was his namesake, and St. Patriarch Tikhon was Metropolitan of North America and established St. Tikhon's monastery and then later seminary, where I graduated actually with my MDiv. So St. Tikhon and our current Metropolitan is Metropolitan Tikhon, who's named after St. Patriarch Tikhon. So the ministry of this Tikhon continues through the generations, through these namesakes after him. And he was a particularly beautiful figure. There's a good book encompassing his teachings called Journey to Heaven, counsels on the particular duties of every Christian, which is very readable for lay people. He says the husband and wife must lay virtue and not passion as the foundation of their love. So when the husband sees any fault in his wife, he must nudge her meekly. This is not even with an elbow. It's more like a pat, right? And the wife must submit to her husband in this, not getting really upset or angry or huffy or defensive or nothing that I'm familiar with. Likewise, when a wife sees some fault in her husband, she must exhort him, and he is obliged to hear. In this manner, their love will be faithful and unbroken, and thereby, having mutually composed their happiness, they shall take pleasure in the virtue. So a wife has this task as well. She must exhort him, and he is obliged to hear her. Remember, like I said, the problem of Adam was not that he listened to his wife, it's that he listened to his wife above the commandment of God. He put her first and not God, which was the mistake. But he was meant to listen to her. He was obliged to hear her exhortation. And so our wives, for husbands, become the foundation of virtue for us. And really, in many respects, I mean, this is kind of common sense, right? This is good for men as a general rule, that men should settle down and be kind of, frankly, domesticated. And wives do that in so many good ways for their husbands. They rein us in our passionate nature, and they help us take that energy and stop wasting it in the dissipation of our youth. And they help us build a family together and really find our true purpose as men, not as boys, adult boys or not adult boys, whatever you want to call it. So I think St. Egon's on to something pretty wise here. Do you agree, my love?
I just want to say, I think this is where marriages often break apart, because we understand in theory what this is asking, but it doesn't have a manual. This doesn't tell us, how do I nudge my husband? How do I exhort my husband? How does he nudge me? Normally, in many situations, this is generally when the nitpicking starts. Something starts to annoy you about your spouse or your potential spouse. And I think what we are greatly lacking is, we're talking, politically, we don't know how to have, civil discourse anymore. I think we even have a great problem in that we don't know how to have civil discourse within a marriage.
You would say that.
Of course. No, I think this is part, we have kind of stopped preparing people how to be married. We're kind of focused on how to have a wedding.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what is more important is these skill sets.
Orthodox is very easy. You want the wedding? You come to church, I do.
Yeah. We're lacking the skills, the verbal skills, in how we can have these discussions when something just seems to not be working right, or we see a fault. How do we do that from a biblical perspective without escalating into a fight, an argument, mudslinging, doing something vindictive? And I think that's kind of, especially on social, because we're so used not being on social media, email, we know how to rapid fire back our responses. Now we project that on the person who we should love the most, who is our spouse. So we're just always on the ready, to have a fire back. And so I think for those that are married or contemplating marriages, I think it's always good to do counseling, because that's the point of counseling. It's a outside person who can kind of say, hey, I'm going to teach you the skill sets in how to have these conversations for a healthy marriage.
Yeah, I like to call it coaching, actually.
Coaching, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not a certified family marriage therapist, so I don't counsel so much as I coach, is in terms of the way I look at it when it comes to weddings and marriages. Okay, so but what transforms marriage into a Christian mystery? What makes it more than just a human institution, right? A civil contract with some type of religious trappings around it. After all, when we look at the Gospels, we can actually see a very skeptical or even negative view sometimes of marriage. For example, the Lord says in Luke chapter 14, if anyone comes to me and does not hate, in the terms of despise or reject or consider to be less than valuable, his father, mother, wife, and children, brothers and sisters, yes, and his own life, he cannot be my disciple. So your married life is valuable and important, but it's not as important as your relationship to Jesus Christ. That's extremely shocking, the Lord says about his family when they come and they're trying to get in and there's a big crowd and the people say, "Hey, Jesus, here are your mother and your brothers." And he says, "But here are my mother and brothers. Whoever does the will of God is my brother and my sister and my mother." So he's showing to the people that the blood relationship is secondary to the spiritual relationship. He wasn't, by the way, saying that his family was not as important to him, because after all, St. James, the brother of the Lord, first bishop of Jerusalem, and his mother, one of the first witnesses of the resurrection. So they were his family, but in a large part because they were the kind of people who heard the will of God and kept it. And in the book of Revelation, the Spirit chides the churches for having left their love. So Christian marriage as a sacrament must make Christ the primary direction of the relationship. A lot of people read with the idea that it's this kind of this two people facing each other and going into each other, but that's actually kind of a really broken view. We are actually two people who are joining into one so that we can face God together and be united with God together. So it's more of a Trinitarian view of communion, of community, not just polarity or duality of two beings in their own self-enclosed universe, right? It's one that actually reaches out towards the heavenly. Now, some people are not going to be called to marriage. So even though we're talking a lot about marriage here, I do want to make the point that monastic tonsure as well is actually a sacramental of the church. As we talked about the differences, you could call it a sacrament as well if you wanted to. I think it deserves it. And the rite of monastic tonsure is like a wedding and is treated as such. If you've ever had the blessing to attend the tonsuring of a nun or even a monk, they even are dressed in white, and it's like they're preparing for marriage. They're giving their life to Christ. They're uniting him in that relationship with a spouse on earth, but within the context of a community of like believers. Now in Matthew, we hear the Lord say this, "And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife," we'll talk more about divorce in a minute, "except for sexual immorality and marries another, commits adultery. And whoever marries her who is divorced commits adultery." So his disciples said to him, "If such is the case of the man with his wife, it is better not to marry." This is a weird verse. So what were they saying? That unless I can freely get divorced, I shouldn't get married? I mean, that seems like it's what they're saying, isn't it? It's kind of a cynical thing for them to say, which is shocking, right? But that was part of the mindset. Like, they wanted to have that escape clause. They liked the fact that the law gave them an escape clause from marriage without really like major consequences, and that Christ was taking that away from them. So you can't just give your wife a certificate of divorce and say, "Be gone, I want somebody else." That is totally unacceptable to the Lord. But he says to them, "All cannot accept this saying, but only to those to whom it has been given." That is to say, not to marry. Not everyone can accept the idea that it would be better not to marry at all. He says, "There are eunuchs who were born thus from their mother's womb," people who were born unable to get married, basically, let's put it that way. "There are eunuchs who were made eunuchs by men," and of course in the ancient world it's a common thing, unfortunately. "And there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake." Now, some literally interpreted this as self-mutilation, and they're like the Encratites, I think is what they were called, in the 2nd century. They didn't last long, obviously, because they didn't have children, but in particular, they were determined to be heretical. So that's not what he meant. Don't do that to yourself, okay? You can be a eunuch for the kingdom of heaven's sake through a life of celibacy. That's the point. And that's what monastic life is a choice to live that celibate life and to take that energy that you would put into relationship with a wife and child bearing and all that, and take all of that energy, and it's a huge amount of energy that you put into that when you decide to do that with your life. That's why when you meet single people in their 40s, they don't have gray hair. They always look nice and young and fresh because they don't know what it's like. But the monastics take all that energy and they put it into the building of the kingdom of heaven. And so he is able to accept it, let him accept it. And so monastic life is a way, if you want to experience the meaning of a married life, but you don't particularly want to be married, or you don't want to have children and stuff like that, you might want to consider a monastic life and see if something like that is something that, could fulfill that desire in you. It's not for everybody, as the Lord says. It's not for all people. And it's really just kind of, in many respects, a very select few of us. And in America, unfortunately, though, it's not common at all because we live in such a materialistic country that the idea of living your life, a religious life, a life pursuing a spiritual vocation is very foreign. In Europe, not so much. In Western Europe, it's become foreign because it's become so atheist. But in Eastern Europe, it was very common for people to have monastics in their families. It was always considered a great blessing. Some people might be upset, I don't want you to become a monk. I don't want you to become a nun. I want you to have kids. I want grandkids, that kind of thing. But many people who have monastics in their family realize the extraordinary blessing that brought, to have a kind of a full-time prayer warrior in the family doing this, prayer all the time on their behalf very often. And when you have monasteries in effectively every county, which you do in places like Romania and Greece and things like that, the monastic life is part of your everyday, not maybe every day, but it's part of your yearly life. You will go to a monastery on a regular basis compared to, say, people in the United States who might not be familiar with it. So it's a beautiful model. I encourage you, if you get the chance to experience what that blessing is like, even just as a pilgrim, to do so. Okay, let's talk about affection and abstinence, since we're talking about celibacy and the distinction between chastity and celibacy, by the way, because we're all called to chastity. Chastity is sexual purity. Chastity is resisting fornication. So how do you be chaste while married? Well, again, Hebrews 13 says the marriage bed is undefiled. There is a chastity which is not celibate which is the married life, the sexual life and marriage. But that life, even as a married couple, needs to be tempered away from the passions. So St. Paul writes extensively about this in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. He says, concerning the things of which you wrote to me, we don't know what that letter was, it's lost, but apparently they're asking him these kind of questions about, what do you think? Should people get married or not? Should we just be like ready for the kingdom? Should we be ready for Jesus to come back and live like Shakers? Basically, was what the Shakers were all about. He said, listen, it's good for a man not to touch a woman. It'd just be a lot easier. And most men would say, that doesn't sound good to me at all. The older you get to realize, you'd be like, yeah, probably would have been good in that case, and so forth. You go, oh yeah, now I get it. There are a lot of cases in which it would probably be a lot wiser. You realize it's in marriage that it becomes a place where it can become good. Otherwise, it's not. Nevertheless, because of porneia, for fornication or sexual immorality, as it's translated, let each man have his own wife, and let each woman have her own husband. Let people marry. Let the husband render to his wife the affection due her, and likewise also the wife to her husband. This is important because there are some very kind of traditionalist views which would say the only time a husband and wife should ever even think about being intimate with each other is when they're trying to have children. And this is almost like that saying we just heard, who can accept it? Well, it shouldn't be the rule for all, because St. Paul himself is not making that rule here. He's saying there is a reason, there is affection that you should render to one another. He's he's obviously not talking here about, cuddling and spooning and just being nice to each other. I mean, he's talking about the sexual relationship. He's saying, have this intimacy with each other for the sake of your marriage, for the sake of your union with one another. For does not have authority over her own, but the husband does. And like the husband does not have authority over her body, but the wife does. This is part of this mutual submission that St. Paul talks about in Ephesians. The sexual relationship here is definitely not a you do what I say relationship, okay? It is, no, my body belongs to you and your body belongs to me. Therefore, we don't have authority we have authority over not ourselves, but over each other. So we can't force ourselves to be using authority over both my body and yours. You see the difference? There is this respect, and it's an equally authoritative respect for when it comes to this issue. It's really important. There's no place within for exploitation, abuse, assault, things like that. And of course, people are perfect. They make a lot of mistakes. But that can definitely hurt a marriage, if not more than else.
And I think the other topic along that line that we don't talk about, I would say wives use this more, is you don't use it as a bargaining chip. Like if you don't do the dish, if you don't do the dishes, no nookie, things like that. It shouldn't be used as a tool of manipulation among both persons.
I can't believe you said nookie on screen.
Keeping it PG.
Keep it PG. Yeah, no, I mean, withholding affection can be kind of just as cruel as trying to steal affection, if you will, taking it when it's not consensual. There needs to be this mutual respect for one another as individuals. And so these things need to be really understood properly. So do not deprive one another except with consent for a time, that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer. So that's important. Do not deprive one another. He's not saying there are some people who will choose to live a married life as husband and wife, but live like, as we say, brother and sister. That is to say, they decide they're going to live a celibate married life. And that can be a great blessing. That's basically like to saying, I kind of wanted to be a monastic, but I kind of wanted to be married, or I kind of didn't really have a choice maybe, and so we're in this. So are you willing to do this? If it's consensual, it's perfectly fine to give yourself to fasting and prayer. But it should be consensual. So even abstinence is something that is engaged by married couples and should be done consensually. And actually in the church, the fasting periods are understood to be periods of abstinence from sexual interactions for husbands and wives. This is always very challenging for those who are living in mixed marriages, where maybe the spouse is not observing the fasts or doesn't have the same kind of understanding of what it's all about. And they're like, you want me to do what? And sometimes they come in and no one ever told them this until later. So I'm making sure in Catechism you hear this so that you're not like baptized and all of a sudden you say, wait, we're supposed to do what? And I can't have what? No, it is a consensual time to focus on the fasting and the prayer. If you were we read something very interesting from the women's Bible study that was last month. Oh, thank you, Praetas. She has to go pick up our daughter from work. And it was, I think St. Jerome was basically saying, I can't, if I have to deprive myself of sexuality in order to fast and pray properly, then I'll never have sex because I want to be focused on fasting and prayer. And that was like an extreme view of that, though. I would say that, because he said we're called to pray without ceasing. Okay, well, if you're a monastic, yes, this is correct. You would do that. But if you're a married couple, you can still live a life of ceaseless prayer, but still live your married life as well. You don't want to think that that's just completely impossible, or that you can't be, even dare I say, prayerfully romantic with your wife. And part of that is approaching it from this kind of chaste mindset, or this dispassionate approach. It's not, and when I say dispassionate, I don't mean like apathetic or clammy or cold. I mean in the sense that you're not feeding into lust. You're actually coming from a place of love and mutual respect. Lust is about control, objectification, selfishness. Come together again, he says, so that Satan does not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. But I say this as a concession, not as a commandment. All right. So he's not saying, force yourselves to go and be intimate for the sake of overcoming sin. But he says, I wish that all men were even as myself, but each has his own gift from God, one in this manner and another. Some are going to be gifted to be able to live very abstinent lives. Others are going to be very kind of passionate and romantic and all those things. And you just have to figure out where you are in that spectrum and make your peace with it before you, and understand that you and your spouse need to be on the same page eventually, as much as possible when it comes to that, and talk about it and be open with each other about it. And just as Adam and Eve were in the garden naked and unashamed, your married life is kind of the one place where you can kind of do that. You can realize, you need to express yourself, and I'm not saying get all weird. I'm just saying I don't like feed fantasy and lust and fetishing and all that kind of stuff. I'm talking about just but be vulnerable. That's the point. Be vulnerable with each other. That's what that intimacy is really about in the end. Okay, any questions about this very awkward subject while we're on it?
I was just kind of wondering, you were talking about doing that in marriage. Like, if you do, I know, like, friends that are Catholic, they do pre-marriage counseling and stuff. Do people cover or explore that before they get married?
Yeah, I talk with couples about this. Actually, I've talked for those who are going to be taking part of this as part of that, right? So I'm very forthright and forward. I like to talk about it because I've even said at a few weddings, I said, we have a lot of prayers in the marriage service about the begetting of children. And so I just want to make sure that you guys, before you do the begetting of your children, you practice thoroughly. And afterwards, you review the process. So I'm an advocate for couples to have a very healthy and satisfying good sex, like Dr. Ruth, but from a Christian perspective, which is to say, it's not about exploring every fantasy. It's not about exploring every tawdry desire. It's about really entering in a place of vulnerability with another human being and being profoundly intimate, and turning something which could be very just animalistic into something which is actually quite spiritual, and an act of communion. If Christ is the bridegroom and the church is the bride, that's a sexual image. In fact, we talk about it as Christ comes forth from the tomb like a bridegroom from the bridal chamber. That's actually a sexual image. That's saying bridegroom coming forth from the wedding bedroom. It's really kind of a shocking image. It's like he comes out of the tomb like a dude who just, consummated his marriage. It's kind of like a really kind of weird but bold image, I think.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so the church has an interesting history with marriage, and one of the challenges may be why not every church necessarily looks at marriage as a sacrament. Most Protestant churches don't consider marriage to be a sacrament, but just a ceremony or a blessing or something like that. And honestly, there is a history to that, even in the church, because not at every time and every place was every Christian marriage from the beginning always done in necessarily a religious way. Okay, it wasn't always mandatory. However, we do see from very early times it being a normative expectation that people who were getting married were in some ways doing it in connection or in conjunction with the church. So, for example, St. Ignatius says in writing to St. Polycarp, speak to my sisters that they love the Lord and be satisfied with their husbands, both in the flesh and spirit. In like manner, also exhort my brethren in the name of Jesus Christ that they love their wives, even as the Lord loves the church. Okay, so that's reiterating Ephesians 5. If anyone can continue in a state of purity to the honor of him who is the Lord of flesh, let him so remain without boasting. Okay, so if you want to be celibate, that's good. And if he begins to boast, he is undone. And if he reckons himself greater than the bishop, he is ruined. So beware of pride. But it says, but it becomes both men and women who marry to form their union with the approval of the bishop, that their marriage may be according to God and not after their own lust. Let all things be done to the honor of God. So this is kind of an initial explanation of how the church becomes involved in the wedding making business, if you will, to be very blunt. You know, the church didn't always bless every marriage at every time. Some marriages were done in a civil ceremony. But over the course of the centuries, in Christian areas, marriages increasingly became the province of the church. And eventually, by the end of the first millennium, pretty much all marriages were being done in the church. Now, there's benefits to that the church is doing that, but there's also difficulties pastorally that then come when the church has to also play kind of the role of an arbiter in civil matters. In the Byzantine Commonwealth, in the Eastern Roman Christian Empire, the church and the state were very close to each other. They worked in what's called symphonia, which was symphonic at best, but sometimes was obviously difficult and complicated because it was a worldly thing. But often the church was in the position of having to manage family law, basically issues of divorce, issues of inheritances, issues of marriages and family issues, because of the pastoral responsibilities that the church had. So eventually the church becomes kind of the main source of the wedding service, and there's not like a separate civil service. Eventually it gets divided out again, as it is today, and you have a distinction between church and state. However, it still is retained even in the United States. For example, in the Commonwealth of Virginia, the state recognizes my authority as a pastor to perform marriages that will be civilly recognized. I am not acting as an agent of the state when I do it. That's not the way I look at it. So I don't feel if the state decides that they want to expand the definition of marriage to include, a horse and his boy or something, I don't care about that. That doesn't mean that I am somehow participating in it. What it means actually is that that state, as confused as it may be about what marriage might be or not be, at least recognizes my authority as a pastor to perform marriages as something that should be recognized by the state. So I consider it to be a good thing that clergy are able to do that. I know some clergy who have stated, I will not sign civil documents anymore, blah, blah. The people still have to go and get civilly married in the court. So you're not doing them any favor. And secondly, you would be pastorally irresponsible as a priest to marry somebody and them not have the legal backing behind that. It would be basically saying, oh yeah, I'll marry you in the church, but you won't have any of the legal protections because you're not civilly married. And that is a disaster. And actually, I had one situation like that where I was misled, honestly, by somebody to say that they presented some weird certificate that I was just a new priest, and I really didn't understand what I was looking at. And it looked legit to me. It was only the application really for the license. It wasn't the complete thing. And they got married, and then the guy decided that he wasn't going to civilly, finally, and later I found out it wasn't actually a legit civil marriage. And so when I said, are you going to marry this woman? She's going to be deported. She was Romanian. She was going to be deported if he didn't do it. He said, no, she got deported. Absolute tragedy. Married in the church. That guy's soul's in terrible danger for that. Very sad situation. So now I make sure it's always going to be that you're going to be legally protected and not just ritualistically united in the church or canonically united. So let's talk about some divorce issues, because this is also a difficult pastoral situation. St. Paul says, "Now to the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord. A wife is not to depart from her husband. But even if she does depart, let her husband remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband. And a husband is not to divorce his wife." So the Lord commands, don't divorce. "But to the rest, I, not the Lord, say, if any brother has a wife who does not believe, and she is willing to live with him, let him not divorce her. And a woman who has a husband who does not believe, if he is willing to live with her, let her not divorce him." So this is in a context, and this is a context which happens for us as Orthodox. People become Christians, or they become Orthodox Christians, more specifically in the current context, and they're married to somebody who may not even be Christian, or is a heterodox Christian who's not Orthodox. Okay, so this is the kind of thing that he's talking about. People were coming into the church, being baptized, being received, and they're married. This is not saying a Christian person then marries an unbeliever. That is actually verboten. Don't do that. We'll see why. "For the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Otherwise your children would be unclean, but now they are holy." So your children, and this is the thing, I get so mad when I have people that come to me from countries that are a little more, they're old countries, and they're stricter, and they say, "Oh, you can't have your child baptized because you're not married to an Orthodox spouse." I'm like, where do you get, that's totally in contradiction to this. Your children are perfectly holy and sanctified, but they think that they're following some strict rule, and that makes them more holy, and it just doesn't. It just makes them stupid, causing people a lot of pain for no reason. Anyway, rant off. You are coming into the church if you are being received into the church by baptism or chrismation. And if you're already married, you're already, in essence, naturally married. You're already one flesh with that person. They are being sanctified through their relationship with you. Not perfectly, not directly, but they are recipients of certain grace because of their life united to you. And the goal should be that eventually they too will be received into the church. And many times it takes years. We've had many people in our church who the spouses came in, and a lot of times, obviously, it's easier if we can say, "Why don't you wait to come into the church until you're both ready, or you both want to do it," because it would be bad to have a divided house. But that's not always going to work either. Sometimes the person's like, I can't go, I can't pretend I'm something I'm not anymore. I'm going to go to the church and so forth. So we've had different situations. Some people become Orthodox, the others take a long time to come. Some people are already Orthodox. They marry outside of the church to somebody who's Episcopalian or Lutheran or whatever, or Catholic, and they work it out however they're going to work it out. Some people decide, I'll be a catechumen while I wait for my wife to or my husband in some cases. Usually it's actually equally one or the other. Wait for them to be ready. And so some people are catechumens for many years because they want to wait for their spouse to join them. But here's an interesting thing now, the next part. "But if the unbeliever departs, let him depart. A brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us to peace." So this is one case in which divorce is permissible in the sense of you don't need to fight it. If somebody's an unbeliever, if they're not a Christian, first of all, and we would extend this to say if they're not even, Orthodox, and they say, "I don't want anything to do with that," well, we would say, okay, well, we're not gonna say bend over backwards to keep that person in place or that marriage intact if that person is going to be a source of spiritual apostasy, possibly. "For how do you know, a wife, whether you will save your husband, or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? Do your best to sanctify them. Do your best to be a great missionary." As some people said, what is an Orthodox convert in the United States? In our church, it's a lot of people in our parish, it's a lot of people who came through their own volition through their own research. But statistically speaking, in the United States, the largest population of Orthodox converts are guys who married a Greek girl. I mean, that's just the reality. That's people who married into the church, and sometimes girls who married Greek guys, as you may know. That is often a way into the church. It's a very noble way into the church. It should not be poo-pooed. Many people have been saved because of that, through that. But mixed marriages are not something we would say, that's your first or ultimate or ideal choice, unless, that person you think they're going to come along and they're going to join you in the faith. And many people, like I said, do join the church even when married to those who are not even Christian, and that is permissible. And that person should not feel like they're somehow less or doing something wrong. That's absolutely not the apostolic teaching. Because how else would the church have grown in those first centuries? There's no other way around it. It's a complicated, difficult situation. One interesting example of the power of marriage to save was the story of St. James the Persian, the great martyr James. St. James was a young man. He kind of got involved in the court of the Persian emperor. He was, high up in the circle and jet setting, so to speak, with the crowd. And he kind of left home to go up to the capital, and there he was seduced by the emperor's, magnanimosity, or whatever the term is, and so he was ashamed to acknowledge himself as a Christian. He decided to, go along to get along, and offered sacrificed idols and committed apostasy. And so when his wife and his mother heard about this, they wrote him a letter and rebuked him, urging him to repent. It's not just they rebuked him; they literally said, we don't even want anything to do with you anymore if that's what you're going to do. If you're going to shame the Lord by your apostasy. I mean, it was just brutal, as worse as you can imagine. And so he received this letter and realized he had really botched, and he asked God for forgiveness. And so he got his opportunity, but it was at the cost of his own life. He decided to repent, and the form of his repentance was to suffer martyrdom at the hand of that same magnanimous emperor who had showered him with so many gifts and glories. So he's considered a great martyr today. Now, this was an interesting. This is just a footnote, more of a trivia point for you guys. Was St. Paul married? Most people would say, yeah, no, he wasn't married. There's no mention of St. Paul's wife or anything like that. But is that the case? 1 Corinthians 7 says, "But I say to the unmarried and to the widows, it is good for them if they remain even as I am. But if they cannot exercise self-control, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn." Does that mean he remain as I am because he is unmarried, or because he is a widower? That's actually not clear from the language there. Philippians 4:3, he says, he's speaking to somebody who is not identified, and he says, "I urge you also, my true yoke fellow, Syzygus, help these women who labored with me in the gospel." No one's quite clear who he was talking about. Could he have been talking about a fellow believing woman who was his wife? And in 1 Corinthians 9, he says, "Do we," meaning me and Barnabas basically, "have no right to take along a believing wife, as do the other apostles, the brothers of the Lord, and Cephas," or Peter? The earliest interpreter of this that we know of is Clement of Alexandria, who, according to Eusebius, said that this verse and the others implied that Paul had indeed a wife, and he was saying, "Is it wrong for me to take my wife with me?" He's the only father, though, that says this, and later fathers, all like Tertullian, Hilary, Epiphanius, and Jerome, all say he was not married. But they're later, so that there's no real solid evidence the case, one way or another. One piece of evidence that I've heard, which is interesting, is that as a rabbinical student under Gamaliel, it would have been expected that he would have been a married man, because in Judaism, you were expected to do your duty vis-a-vis marriage and childbirth on behalf of the people, right? So it was probable that he was a married man, but he might have been at that point a widower. Who knows? By the time of 1 Corinthians 7, he says, as I am, so it seems to imply that he was not living a married life. So however it turned out, it is a complicated question. I guess Clement's interpretation doesn't make a lot of sense if 1 Corinthians 9 follows 1 Corinthians 7, right? So, but nonetheless, I just thought it was an interesting thing to study. I like to think he was a widower because it suggests to me that he had that pastoral insight into married life, because he seemed to have a pretty good idea of what he was talking about. Okay, so here's a couple things to let you know about mixed marriage from modern sources. First of all, we had just a few years ago this council in Crete. Some people call it the Great and Holy Council of Crete. I think that's a little preemptory. I just call it the Council of Crete. It's still authoritative in its own respect. It's no ecumenical council, as some would like to say, but it is certainly worthy of consideration. They write, considering mixed marriages of Orthodox Christians and non-Orthodox Christians, or non-Christians, marriage between Orthodox and non-Orthodox Christians is forbidden according to canonical ekravia. Ekravia means the strictness. So strictly speaking, by the time of the Quinisext Council, which is the fifth, in between the 5th and 6th, or it's around that period, 600s, they had already decided, no, Orthodox Christians should only be marrying other Orthodox Christians. That was the strict canon. However, with the salvation of man as the goal, the possibility of the exercise of ecclesiastical economia, or good stewardship, in relation to impediments to marriage must be considered by the Holy Synod of each autocephalous church, according to the principles of the Holy Canons and in a spirit of spiritual discernment. So, each autocephalous church needs to establish how it's going to actually exercise that. So some of the churches have maintained the ekravia because they live in countries which are dominantly Orthodox. The population, it's not a problem as much to be able to say that. I still think it's pastorally unkind. I think it's unnecessary and unkind to say that. But that's the strictness of the canons. But nonetheless, marriage between Orthodox and non-Christians, so to a Jew, a Muslim, a Buddhist, a pagan, whatever, a Hindu, are categorically forbidden in accordance with canonical ekravia. So if you are already Orthodox, you cannot marry outside of a Trinitarian Christian, basically. This is of course a cause of many difficult situations, because people fall in love with who they fall in love with. And I'm not like, don't want to be the arbiter and say, well, sorry, and I've known people who are like, the priest just says, oh, you can't do that, and just kind of like tries to cut it off at the root, instead of saying, wow, that's really great that you're in love. Maybe we should sit and talk about how the different worldviews might contradict each other, and would your spouse be willing to be received into the church so that you could be of one mind in your house and one spirit, and really, express all the benefits of being of one faith, instead of kind of saying, you can't do that. Always strictness is going to hurt. It's not the best approach. So unfortunately, as a result of that, those who tend to take this super strict view end up just losing their parishioners, because you can get married anywhere in this country. Anyone will marry you. And if your church is being cruel to you or insensitive to your relationship, a lot of people don't realize what's at stake spiritually, and they think, well, what matters is what I want right now, and so I'm going to go where they're going to give it to me. And I've seen a lot of unnecessary damage. I always try to bring people in and say, let's let's talk it through. Let's work it out. And when people realize what we're trying to offer them to have, the beauty of this unified faith in Jesus Christ, this and what that really means, it usually works out pretty well. We're in, the priest should be in sales, not management, as Father Barnabas says. Now, the OCA uses this economia wisely, in my opinion. So in their standards set forward in the guidelines in 1996, does it say? A mixed marriage is a marriage between an Orthodox Christian and a non-Orthodox Christian who is baptized in a Trinitarian fashion, who confesses the unique lordship of Jesus Christ. So they're a believing Christian, just not Orthodox. They're heterodox, but still Trinitarian. The church tolerates the mixed marriage because of her pastoral concern and love for the faithful. I've married many people who the spouse was Catholic or whatever. Thus, a mixed marriage is not the norm. It really is probably statistically in this country nowadays, but it is permitted in the hope that the non-Orthodox spouse will seek entrance into the church. And sometimes that does happen. And if we're, decent people about it, not jerks, it's more likely to happen. So it's not hard. Don't break things. Don't fix things that aren't broken, and don't break things to fix them. A petition for a mixed marriage needs to be submitted. This is a small formality in the Orthodox Church. We don't have any process of what do you call it? What are those things? The annulments and all that garbage. We don't do any of that stuff. It's a dispensation. It's very simple. You don't have to go to any hearings or anything weird like that. It's not very expensive. It's like a $20 processing fee. It's do it all the time. In a mixed marriage, the Orthodox partner should not consent to have the children of the union baptized outside the Orthodox Church as a pre-marriage agreement. There was a time in our diocese where we would ask people to, and we actually still ask them. We call it a voluntary statement which is a misnomer, because we want you to sign the statement and answer it one way. It's voluntary in how you answer it, but the bishop still wants you to answer it. So it's an voluntary statement, which says we have decided to remain separate in our faith. We have decided we will respect each other's faith, but we will baptize the children Orthodox, or whatever. There's a couple different answers and so forth. But we don't want people to say, if I marry this person, I'm consenting to never baptize my children Orthodox. That would be that would not be good for us. We would not want to approve of that kind of a relationship. Toleration of a mixed marriage does not extend to marriage between an Orthodox Christian and non-Christian person. Active participation of non-Orthodox clergy in the service. Sometimes people say, can I have my pastor or my priest come and do something? Well, not in the weddings. And I've been asked, because I have friends that got married, they want me to participate in the wedding. And I'm like, I'm sorry, I don't have permission. I would love to. Honestly, I really would. But I'd love to marry you in my church too. So it kind of doesn't work anyway. But I would love to participate in some way. And but I don't have permission. I don't have the authority to do that. I'm not representing myself. I represent the Orthodox Church and the episcopacy that I am under. Conversely, Orthodox clergy may not participate in non-Orthodox service and rites. One of the ways in which we generally work around this is, like, if they do have somebody like that, we ask them to give a blessing at the meal, at the reception. It's fine, whatever, we work it out. And usually that's satisfactory. It's about representation and inclusion. People want to know that their family is respected. We're not trying to disrespect people. We do have a way of doing things, and obviously it's a pretty set way. But we don't need to be jerks about it. Let's put it that way. Again, this does not apply to people who have been received into the church already married. People who are married to non-Christians are received into the church all the time, just as they were in the first century. None of this is applying to them. This is people who are already Orthodox seeking to get married. Any questions about any of this stuff so far? It's everything you wanted to know and not more than you wanted to know, I'm sure. Yeah, Hank.
I was just curious about the last part that you said. So if somebody is Orthodox already and they marry somebody outside of the church, does that have any effect on their membership in the church, or
yes.
just the ceremony? Okay.
No, yes, it would put them in a state of technical excommunication, or they would have to go under penance at that point, because they've now participated in first of all, they've not sanctified their marriage correctly, and they've participated maybe in a service of another church or something like that.
Yeah.
That makes it
Okay.
very complicated pastorally. Most of the time, if there's somebody, and for the sake of the peace of the marriage, and they're in a position where they're like, my wife's family would be devastated if they couldn't have it in their family church or something like that. I'm like, and the bishop would not agree with me on this. Probably he would not be happy with me for saying this, but pastorally, I use my blind eye to say, well, why don't you do what they need you to do, and then come and we'll normalize the marriage through the rite of crowning in the Orthodox Church. We'll do the wedding service in the Orthodox Church too, but you don't need to make the big deal out of it. Because remember, people are thinking about the wedding day and all that stuff, and their dreams and their romantic visions and all that. And I don't care about that. I would like, if you want to do all that stuff, that's not a big deal to me. I just want to make sure that you get the sacramental sealing of your marriage in the church.
Okay.
That's the thing that matters to me. So if you go and your spouse is like, we need to have our wedding at the beach and do all blah, 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 blah. Like, I don't, it's like, as long as we can eventually do your wedding in the church, just if it's you and me and one sponsor, doesn't have to be anybody else. No one even has to know about it. All right. Just so that your marriage is received by God and blessed by God. To me, that's the thing that matters in the end. I know the bishop would rather, if he knows, he was like, I'm not going to give a blessing to that. He's done that to me in the past. What do you, so now I just basically say, I just don't even raise the issue. I'm like, I have a couple that want to get married in the church and they're mixed. Can I get a dispensation? Boom, done. So what he doesn't know. Of course, I'm recording this, so I'm going to get in lots of trouble, I'm sure. But
Well,
I think,
sorry for asking then.
yeah, you're getting me in trouble. But again, this is when the difficulty, when the church gets involved in things that are also part of like civil matrimonial law and things like that. It gets complicated and it gets entangled. And it's my least favorite part of my job my favorite part of my job is when I get to do things like weddings. My least favorite part of my job is when I have to handle this kind of stuff that gets complicated, because it's like, wow.
Yeah,
we just want to bless your marriage. We don't want to make it hard for you. We just want to see you be blessed.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So,
sorry, Father, I have a question.
Yes.
So does that mean that two converts who were married before joining need to go through that ceremony?
No.
Okay.
We're going to get to that. Those who are received into the church are received as married people. Now, this is where Father Josiah and I actually butt heads once, because he actually said, I couldn't believe I was hearing it because I'd never heard anybody say this, but he's in a different diocese, in a different jurisdiction, so that might be what their economia is for them. But he was saying that somebody who's a convert, who's not married to an Orthodox person, needs to have their wedding crowned as well. Otherwise, they're immediately, as soon as they're received, they're in a state of excommunication because they're in a mixed marriage. And I'm like, I was like, my jaw hit the ground and hit me in my face on the way back up. I was like, where did you get that? And I said, that is absolutely not the practice of the OSA. The OSA explicitly states converts who are received into the church as married people are received as married people. They do not need to have their marriages regularized or crowned or anything like that. Now, some people have asked me, they're like, we've converted, but we never had a church wedding. Could we have our marriages crowned in the church? That's an interesting question. And actually, it's a situation which I'm in the middle of having to answer for right now, because somebody just recently asked me that. And if I did it before, I don't even remember, honestly, what the outcome was. So I have to ask the bishop, can I do a wedding crowning for a couple who never had their wedding crowned? It's not that they feel that they need their wedding normalized, but they never had a church wedding and they would like their wedding blessed. Can I do the crowning? He may say, no, just do the Moleben for the anniversary. which is a church service, and it's a blessing of the marriage. So, again, does it matter in the end? I don't know, but the OCA standard guidelines they're not required to. Let's put it that way.
Well, I just think from my perspective, it just needs to be asked, is this something that's going to heal you as a couple on the Christian level to have this done? Or is it because the Orthodox wedding service, in my opinion, is the most beautiful wedding service, and you like the romance of it, and you want a wedding? It's not about the marriage. You want a wedding. So I think those are good questions, to ask. If you're in that situation, is this to really get your marriage on more solid ground, and it's for all the right reasons, and not just because you want to party, wear the white dress, or the glittery crowns, all that.
And that's in this situation, I was willing to go and say, yeah, I'm going to ask the bishop, because I could tell it wasn't out of like a fantasy. It was out of a genuine faith-based desire to sanctify the marriage and recognize the desire for that blessing in their life. So I was like, yeah, I'll ask him. I'd be willing to do that. I don't like withholding services. I think anytime we're in a position where we're withholding services, there really has to be a salvific reason to want to do that. That should be our guiding principle of pastoral concern. Like, if I did this would be bad for your salvation or bad for your faith, that, or for the faith of others, for that matter. Otherwise, let's do it. Okay, let's talk a little bit about divorce then. Again, we already talked a little bit about it, but the Bible is really strong in this. This is so powerful. Malachi chapter 2. The Lord says, "And you do these things which I hate. You cover the altar of the Lord with tears, with weeping and moaning because of troubles, yet still thinking it is worthy to look upon your sacrifice or take it as acceptable from your hands." Why? Because the Lord has been a witness between you and the wife of your youth, whom you have forsaken. Yet she is your companion and the wife of your covenant. He did not make another, having a remnant of his spirit. Yet you ask, what else does God seek but offspring? Meaning, if I didn't have kids, what does it matter? But take heed to your spirit. Do not forsake the wife of your youth. But if you hate her and send her away, says the Lord God of Israel, ungodliness will obscure your thinking, says the Lord Almighty. So take heed to your spirit that you do not forsake her. Wow. The Lord hates when people forsake their marriages. In this case, it's a more specific excuse was being given that, well, we didn't have kids, so what's the harm, right? But the harm is this woman who didn't have kids, maybe now no one will marry her because they think she can't have kids, or maybe she can't have kids and now no one will marry her and she's going to be left destitute. That was a real issue and it's still a real issue today, by the way. We think that with all the kind of the equity issues and the progress that's been made, that women will be fine. Women are still vulnerable people in society, and in most societies, globally speaking, and divorce is a form very often of exploitation of saying, you know what, I don't want to be responsible for you anymore, and kick you to the curb and things like that. And the women have certainly gotten better representation in court, obviously, and have better outcomes in divorce courts. It's still going to be hard, and divorce is a really harmful thing. I always tell people, before you rush into, and I tell women this too, before you rush into a divorce, I know if your marriage is suffering, and they come to me and their marriage is suffering, really be clear about what's going to happen, because the divorce is like the nuclear option. You're going to divide the household, you're going to divide the incomes, you're going to divide the assets. The two are not stronger separately than the one united. So there will be economic repercussions for the rest of your life, possibly. It could be very harmful. When women make more money in the household than the men, they're like, yeah, it's fine with me, right? Because all of a sudden they don't have that problem. But that's a rare thing still. They're, say what you want about the causes of the wage gap. There is a wage gap. I mean, there is an earnings gap. Let's put it that way. And I don't think it's always just because, women are, and it's actually probably rarely because women are being paid this less for the same job. It's because men are generally working jobs that are getting paid for, and less women work those jobs. That's what's this. Jonathan, you're the economist. You can tell me if I'm wrong about that. But it is an economic issue, and it's justice issue that we've made divorce so easy and so expensive. The people who benefit the most from it are the lawyers. And speaking of, have you heard of this practice? This is from my Gen X friend. Anybody? Can't make a joke about divorce. That's terrible. Isn't that awesome?
That is, but it's terrible.
It's terrible. I have a dark sense of humor. Anyway, I can't say how much I don't like divorce, and I'm probably a priest who has actually recommended divorce more than any other priest I know, because there are, why is that popping up? Okay, there are situations in which I think divorce is the better option. Of course, the Lord said when there's sexual immorality, when there's adultery. Honestly, I've seen marriages recover from adultery and sexual immorality and become really strong marriages. So even if that happens, and that's a horrible situation, if both spouses are willing to do some really dig deeping and personal work and spiritual work, they can heal that marriage, and it can become something even greater than it ever was before. But there are marriages in which there is not true fidelity. The other person is not just adulterous in their sexual relationships and morality. They're not really, they're living in two worlds, right? They're like, they keep their own finances completely separate. They have hidden finances. They've had one foot out the door the whole time. That I would recommend a divorce. I'd recommend that person repent. But as soon as a person becomes abusive and physically threatening, then I have no patience for that. Because I'm a spiritual father. If you abuse my spiritual child, you're physically threatening them. We got problems. I have a duty as a spiritual father to protect my child, and that might mean I would recommend them getting out of that relationship, because you are by no means Christ-like, and you're by no means fulfilling your calling as a Christian. So don't pull that card on me, right? I will withstand you to your face, and I'd be happy to put my fist in your face if I have to, if you threaten one of my children, and that includes all my parishioners. So I have no patience for that. There are things that break marriages for good and cannot be tolerated. So sometimes divorce is okay. Sometimes divorce is the only way to actually equitably resolve an unjust situation. For example, a husband who has decided to abandon his family effectively. Sometimes the only way to secure the rights for the person who has been abandoned, and it could be a wife abandoning her husband, is divorce, because divorce then provides the legal foundation for custody, for property rights, for alimony. That's all a justice issue, which is important and needs to be treated seriously. If a person is gone or they're not coming back, they're not coming back, right? And hanging on and doing your Christian duty when there's bills to pay and you're going to be evicted, and your children are in danger, that's not good management of the household, right? So we use good stewardship in those respects, and we don't penalize a person who's been abandoned. We've had bishops who are divorced. We are actually today celebrating the birthday of Bishop Policarp Murushka, who was the first bishop of our diocese, who came from Romania in 1936 or something like that, and helped establish our diocese as a proper diocese from Romania. He was actually a divorced man. But it wasn't because he said, I don't want to be married anymore. His wife left him. And that actually happens, unfortunately, to a lot of clergy. Not a lot, but it does happen, because sometimes they realize, I did not sign up for this priestly life. I don't want to be married to a priest. I hate it. I hate it. I hate it. And they leave, and they abandon their husband. Well, he has a choice. He can't get remarried and remain a priest. So sometimes he becomes a monk, and sometimes a monk who's a priest becomes a bishop. So we've had divorced priests become bishops. Was there a question in the chat?
Father, this is Jonathan.
Oh, yeah, St. Maria, yeah.
I added 2 quotations. One is from late 4th, early 5th century, showing the church fathers weren't always absolutely opposed to divorce. St. Epiphanius of Salamis said, "He who cannot keep continence after the death of his first wife, or was separated from his wife for a valid motive, as fornication, adultery, or another misdeed, if he takes another wife, or if the wife takes another husband, the divine word does not condemn him nor exclude him from the church or the life, but she tolerates it rather on account of his weakness."
Yeah, that's the basis for what we're about to look at here. Is the standards of second and third marriages, for example, are permissible. We don't have annulments. We don't try to say you have to pretend that the first marriage wasn't a real marriage now.
Even though you had kids.
Even though you had kids. That drives me nuts. This whole annulment thing in the Catholic Church is the biggest legal loophole nonsense. It's a racket. I hate it. It's just so stupid.
And St. Maria Paris was divorced twice. She wasn't practicing the Orthodox faith the first time. The second time, it was actually with a consultation of her bishop.
Yeah. She was a Bolshevik originally, basically, right? She was kind of a socialist. So then realized the error of her ways. But she's an interesting character too. The smoking nun, I like to think of her. But what a holy martyr. She's a holy martyr, and she was an incredible saint. You should get to know her. If you need a patron saint of the modern woman, St. Maria of Paris is your gal. She's something else. Okay, so here's some basic standards about marriage, and we'll probably end with this because this is about, I think there's only a couple before we get to the rite itself. Premarital sex, forbidden by the church. What does that mean? The church is not going to break through the window in the middle of the night and catch you in your bed doing the dirty deed. What it means is, if we're committing fornication, we're having sex before marriage or outside marriage, we should not be approaching the holy chalice. We should not be pretending that we're living as Christ enjoined us to live. Okay? We should be withholding, we should be waiting, we should be abstaining, we should be being engaged to somebody and not practicing before marriage. Okay? That will not help. That will not make your marriage better. Sowing your wild oats will not prove that you are more of a accomplished lover. Okay, will not make you more of a mature person. It will just waste that precious time and energy that you had in your life to grow in God. And so it's not about judging people for having these desires. We understand. We've made a culture and a society in which it's very hard now for people to get married young and be successful. People who marry young tend to divorce. They're immature. We don't raise mature young people anymore. We raise children who are children into their 20s and tend to not figure out what it means to be an adult until they hit their 30s. It's a real problem that we have as a culture. And we ask them to abstain from sex at the prime period of their life when their body is telling them to do this, because they were meant to be getting married and having children by these ages. That's a whole cultural problem that we have. I don't know an easy solution around that other than to encourage families. If you have young people, encourage a culture of marriage. Let them know that you are going to financially help them, support them, give them a good place to start from so that they're not trying to do this all on their own. Be a good model in your marriage of what marital love, affection, fidelity, and partnership looks like, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Marriage is under attack from every direction right now, and it's not a surprise we have such high rates of divorce. The divorce rate is only going down now because people are just not even getting married anymore. They're just cohabitating. That's not good news. Abortion is going down not because people are having less sex, but because, well, actually it is, there are people having less sex now, but for a while it was because they're just having more kids out of wedlock. Well, that's not a great solution either. It's better than abortion, but it's not a symptom of, a good situation. Divorce and remarriage are normally forbidden except in extreme situations such as sexual infidelity, as we read from St. Epiphanius of Salamis. We do not begrudge people to be remarried if they've been widowed or their spouses left them and so forth. Second and third marriages are permitted, but they generally involve penance. The actual right for a second marriage is slightly different than the marriage right for the first marriage if both people are previously married. If only one person has been previously married, then we still do the rite of a first marriage for the person who has never been married before. We don't put them through the penitential rite. And it's not a horribly penitential rite. It's just simply recognizing that usually people getting remarried in that second rite they're generally older, maybe they've already had kids. It's assuming kind of a different set of life circumstances. Let's put it that way. Marriages outside of the church can be recognized as natural marriages, such as converts entering the church. Marriages are elevated in the church to a sacramental status, and marriage is more, not less, than a contract. It's not just a civil contract. It does involve that, by the way, and the betrothal service is actually a liturgicalized version of the binding contract of the ancient betrothal system of the ancient world. So there is a contractual element, right? We say, have you joined yourself to any other? Have you pledged yourself to any other? No, I have not, Reverend Father. Have you joined yourself to any other? No, I have not, Reverend Father. That kind of thing. We make sure that the people are entering into this relationship and understand there's a covenanting going on here that doesn't allow for others. We don't allow fourth marriages because that's right out. That's a Monty Python reference, I guess. But anyway, here's another bit from the Council of Crete. The pressing issue in society today is marriage, which is the center of the family, and the family is what justifies marriage. Pressure to recognize new forms of cohabitation constitute a real threat for Orthodox Christians. This variously manifested crisis in marriage and family profoundly concerns the Orthodox Church, not only in light of negative consequences for the fabric of society, but also in light of its threat to particular relationships within the bounds of the traditional family. Expanding the definition of marriage may seem like a kind and generous thing, but it also puts at risk more and more children who will be the products of unstable and easily divorcing and more frequently divorcing relationships. The main victims of these trends are the couples themselves, and especially the children, since regrettably the children often endure great suffering from an early age, while nonetheless bearing no responsibility they didn't ask for these parents, right? A civil marriage between a man and a woman registered in accordance with the law lacks sacramental character, since it is a simple legalized cohabitation recognized by the state, different from a marriage blessed by God and the church. So generally speaking, even though we require that civil marriage, we still want you to be blessed in the church. The members of the church who contract a civil marriage ought to be regarded with pastoral responsibility and care, which is necessary to help them understand the value of the sacrament of marriage and the blessings connected with it. The church does not allow for her members to contract same-sex unions or any other form of cohabitation apart from marriage. The church exists all possible pastoral efforts to help her members who enter into such unions understand the true meaning of repentance and love is blessed by the church. Side note caveat, because you know me, I like to always throw out the historical exception to the rule. And there's an interesting book that came out about 20 years ago or so, maybe 25 years ago, by, what's his name? Boswick, I think was the scholar, examining a Byzantine rite from about 1,000 years ago called the Rite of Brother Making. And if you read it from a liturgical historian's point of view, you can see that it is not a same-sex union in the sense of as a homosexual marriage. It is clearly a sacramentalizing or liturgizing approach to how to establish a relationship between two people who are not blood relatives, but who wish to establish a kind of a connection. So the idea was that you were basically kind of making somebody your godparent or your sponsor, in a sense that now they become legally responsible for you, and they have inheritance rights and things like that. So it fulfills actually the kind of much of that respect of what a civil union legally fulfills, but it was not meant to be a demonstration of a sexual relationship, but actually an establishment of a familial relationship where no blood relationship existed. So if you understand the cultural context in which it was originally formulated, it makes sense liturgically. But it is also very clear that it did become used as a same-sex union rite in the Middle Ages, because the express reason that that rite is no longer used and why it went out of service and out of favor was because people recognized that it was being used as kind of a liturgical cover for a same-sex union in those settings. So it's not 100% right to say the church has never recognized same-sex unions. It has certainly never endorsed same-sex unions, but there have been these rites that have been used at times that have been used by people to accomplish those ends, which is not me saying that I'm in favor of it. It's just me saying this is not a new issue that just existed in the 20th, like gay people existed before the 20th century is what I'm saying, and figuring out how people would figure out their lives has been a concern throughout many centuries before this. And it's a complicated issue, and one that we should take very carefully, compassionately, sensitively, and as graciously as we possibly can, because it's a difficult situation. No one asked to be in that situation, right? Or if somebody did, would be the extraordinarily rare situation. Yes, Jonathan.
Father, I put the link to an Orthodox Wiki article on it, Adelphoi Oasis, I guess, which literally means brother making.
Yeah.
And I also shared the Wikipedia article. The Wikipedia article has an interesting reference. There's a scholar at Catholic University. Apparently, this rite is still done occasionally in the Oriental Orthodox churches, and so there was a scholar at Catholic University who actually went through the rite, and it was very clear that the rite in the Oriental Orthodox churches was not meant as a sexual union, but was essentially blessing two women, in this case two women, who were close to each other, and basically blessing them to live in as sisters with each other. So
yeah.
So that's at least the intention of it, and I thought the articles were interesting.
Yeah, and I mean, how soon was that euphemistically interpreted as cover for a same-sex union? It's hard to say. Probably, I would assume pretty early on, because frankly, at least with regards to women, the Byzantine Emperor tended to be actually quite tolerant of women, of lesbian relationships, simply because they actually considered it better than living in sin with a man. However, they were also a very machismo-oriented society, and they didn't have the same necessary tolerance per se for male homosexuality, which they considered to be, effeminating and so forth like that. So they had their own culture. They had their own culture. They had their own standards that coming out of Greco-Roman history. So again, I don't like to confuse specific historical cultural periods and their cultural norms with ours, and vice versa. But understanding the context in which these services, took on their usages is valuable, I think. And seeing how we try to wrestle with these issues today is also an interesting and important effort that we have to make as Christians. Father Schmemann? of blessed memory, said, a marriage which does not constantly crucify its own selfishness and its own self-sufficiency. That includes married people thinking they're an island of their own, right? Which does not die to itself that it may point beyond itself, is not a Christian marriage. In the Christian marriage rite of the Orthodox Church, there's a beautiful prayer which says, Lord, grant them to have an abundance of earthly things, so that having sufficiency in all things, they will have an abundance to help others. The purpose of marriage is to take two people's productivity together, not just spiritually, but also but economically, to create something that will be a blessing to others. Your marriage is your primary foundation from which you do your charitable works. I can do the charitable works I do. I can do the charitable giving that I do, not just because of the work that I do as an individual, but also because living in a household with my wife, we have a household economy which absorbs so much of the expenses. It's not a surprise that people who live in poverty, if you are not married, you are at a much greater risk of poverty. It's more expensive to live on your own than it is to live in partnership with others. And actually that fits with monasteries too, because monasteries, then you take a whole group of people combining their productivity and pooling their energy, their efforts, and their ability to generate income in essence. And that's why monasteries can be so incredibly actually well endowed, because they have a lot of people working together for vision and creating a house or habitation for God together, which the sum is greater than the parts, or whatever the phrase is. So there's some temptations that we could have. I know we're going over, but since I don't have Vespers, I didn't mind today. The family can become an idol. A lot of people, especially people who think they're good Christians, who practice idolatry of the family. I would do anything for my family. Family comes first. Blood is thicker than water. These are all anti-Christian ideas. They really are. The water of baptism should be the thing that unites us. The blood of Christ is the thing that should unite us. And if we do not love Christ more than father or mother or husband or wife or brother or sister, we're not worthy of Christ. He says it. Marriage itself needs to point beyond itself, and not only towards the charitable works of others, but it points to the glory of God. It should be something that glorifies God. We'll look at the service next week and see how the prayers actually point to that. Happiness as the goal of marriage is actually a mistake. Happiness is an outcome of a successful marriage, but it is not the goal of marriage. Just like anything in life, the ultimate purpose of life is something greater than ourselves. It is communion with a much greater purpose. It's communion with God. And so we do that through the cross. And by doing and accepting the cross, we actually can experience real happiness. Because if we're chasing happiness, happiness is elusive. Happiness will always be just, if I do one more thing next year, or one more raise, or one more addition to the house, or whatever it is, that people create these things that they think will make them happy. And marriages suffer because they're always looking for the next thing that they think will make their marriage better, when it's right here all along. The cross, the Lord, and loving one another as Christ loved the church. All that stuff will be taken care of. All that stuff will fall into place. In Christian marriage, three are united: the husband, the wife, and the Lord. It's a Trinitarian model, if you will. So I think that's the last stage. Oh, no. Okay. I guess I got a couple of things. To summarize, marriage and monasticism are two paths to salvation. They're actually they're complementary to each other. A healthy marriage should feel a little bit like a monastery, and a healthy monastery should have the quality of a healthy family life, a good marriage of people, so to speak. Not everyone is called to the same kind of struggle, and single people can also benefit from those who are married around them and those who are monastic around them, even if they don't live in monastic tonsure, right? Single people still need to live in a community of persons, and they still need to have these experiences of brotherhood and sisterhood with each other and learn this lesson of mutual struggle together in self-sacrifice for one another. So marriage becomes a model for the rest of society, not just for those who are in the institution of marriage. And that, I think we've actually just, you see that a lot. You see people who they've soured on their own families, and they come up with this idea, well, I've created my own family. I understand that 100%. I think that's a very Christian idea, that for many, especially in the early centuries when people were coming from paganism, their families were disavowing them, and so they found their new families in the Christian church, and a lot of people do that. So I understand that principle. But as Christian families, we shouldn't be the ones casting people out. We should be the ones saying, this is how to be incorporated. This is what it means to be included in a communion of love with one another. Okay, here's some more OSEA guidelines, just in case you were wondering. Elvis weddings are right out. Orthodox Christians who marry outside the church thereby exclude their marital life from the life of the church, and therefore exclude themselves from participation in the Holy Eucharist, and exclude themselves from full membership of the church. Such persons, after a period of penance, may be restored to Eucharistic fellowship by recommendation from the priest on approval of the hierarch. Normally, such an act of restoration includes confirmation of the marriage through a rite approved of the hierarch. So, long story short of what I was talking about earlier, get your wedding blessed in the church at some point and fix the problem. I actually did that for one family. You were the sponsor, right? For David and Tammy.
Oh, yeah.
And they had been, because it was one of those things where her family was like not into it, and she didn't realize she became a very fervent convert eventually. But it took that uniting of them in the church through a crowning rite. It was just us, their parents, her parent, or his parents. I think it was like that. It was like nobody else. It was, and we solved it. And then now they're like super Orthodox family. Priests are reminded that converts to Holy Orthodoxy are not to be remarried when they embrace the Orthodox faith. So this is from the strict OSEA guidelines that we follow in our diocese. On childbearing, tell me if you want to stop, by the way. I'm just going till I get to the service part. Childbearing is a means of salvation. It is something that is given to us for our salvation. Through childbearing, we learn what it means to die for another. We learn humility, whether we like it or not. Procreation is a command given to Adam and Eve: be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. In the Orthodox marriage service, we pray over and over again that the couple may be granted children for the continuation of the race, and for their salvation. Children are a heritage of the Lord. We sing this psalm in the service itself. We have many saints that are parents, such as Saints Zebulon and Susanna are a good example. Saints, the parents of the Holy Cappadocians, the parents of Saint Basil the Great and Saint Macrina and so forth are saints as well. So there's lots of really beautiful parent saints out there. Some families, though, have a problem. Obviously, they can't have children, or they don't have children, or they get married later in life and they're at the point where they no longer can have children. That's okay. But a couple should never go into a marriage saying, we want to get married, but we don't want to have children, or we never want to have children. That's something kind of selfish about that. We would not normally recommend that. We would say, listen, it's great that you love each other, that you want to live for each other and so forth like that. But that's that narrow view in which your world is enclosed in on itself. You should at least be open to having children if they should come. You should not try to prevent it from happening. In all cases, you should allow the possibility to happen. And if it's impossible for you as a couple, you should consider parenting as a foster, as an adoptive parent, and if nothing else, as a godparent, and if nothing else, as somebody's lovable and wacky uncle or aunt, because we all need those. being involved in the raising of children is a responsibility for all of us. What's her name? Hillary Clinton said it takes a village. It takes a church. It takes a church to raise a Christian. And that means more than just a mother and a father. They are the primary ones, but they also, if you're not the parent, you can still be a godparent or a spiritual parenting figure in many different ways. I'm the father of many, many children outside of my marriage through spiritual fatherhood. Mentoring, yes. So that's an important thing as well. Synodal affirmations on these subjects, just in case you were wondering. While marriage has not in itself the sole purpose of marriage, a marriage without the desire for children and the prayer of God to bear and nurture them is contrary to the sacrament of love. Therefore, the Synod affirms these points. Procreation of children is to take place in the context of a marital union where the father and mother accept the care of the children whom they conceive. Marriage children out of wedlock is not the ideal. It's common practice today. It's not good. It's not good for the kids. They're at a higher risk of so many negative consequences. Married couples may express their love in sexual union without always intending the conception of a child, but only those means of birth control and conception within marriage that are acceptable and do not harm a fetus already conceived. So there are some forms of birth control that cause kind of abortion or cause a conceived egg to be vacated. That would not be good. So avoid forms of abortifacient birth control. Married couples may use medical means to enhance conception of their common children, but the use of semen or ova other than that of the married couple who both take responsibility for their offspring is forbidden. So we would say, and we would also say, avoid IVF because it creates multiple embryos. And the problem is that people, because it's such an expensive thing to do, they make all these embryos, but then they don't use them all. Now you have frozen embryos that go to waste. They're killed. That is not a good solution to the problem. There's other ways of loving a child besides creating a bunch and only bringing to term one or two. That is definitely not the right way of going about it. Now, somebody might say, well, what about adopting an embryo, a frozen embryo that's already been conceived? Obviously, it's not an ideal situation, but I would be much happier that that embryo be carried to term in a willing and loving mother and in a family than it be destroyed. So I think that is something that we would, while not necessarily say we should create the circumstances for that to happen by IVF. If there is a circumstance in which we could save one of those embryos, I think that we would err on that side and say that's definitely a good thing. It's a complicated world we live in. We have science that is beyond what we imagine. On parenting, since every fatherhood in heaven and on earth takes its name from the fatherhood of God, fathers in domestic, ecclesial, and monastic families, together with holy mothers, are called to mediate, to be God's presence, and to show God's action to their children. The sacraments of marriage and ordination, as well as monastic tonsure and the rites of making abbots and abbesses, testify to this calling of fatherhood, spiritual fatherhood. So therefore, the family, a father, mother, and children with the extended family of God, grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins, is to be supported and protected as the basic condition of life for human beings in this world. Children are to be provided with the fullest and deepest possible experience of a secure family life and activity. And the family is not to be idolized as an end in itself, becoming an obstacle rather than a means to a healthy and holy spiritual life in communion with God and the church. The worst excuse you could ever use for not coming to church or not getting people involved is because of family. You're now sinning against God and your family if you do that. So God help. Don't do that. Don't do that. Okay. That's it for today. Long story, 2-hour class today, bonus class. And next week we'll talk about the rite itself of the wedding service, which will be only a few slides. And then we'll get into what's next? Holy Unction, I think. We're kind of coming to the end. No? That would be, what else do we have? We did baptism, chrismation, Eucharist, ordination, and marriage, right? So
The funeral is the last one, Father.
unction, but we have one more than unction, though, right?
No, it's the funeral. The funeral.
Am I forgetting one? 7 sacraments, right? Pop quiz.
It's the funeral.
That's it?
No.
No, is there one more, though, that we have to cover? Unction, and what else? Something. Am I totally gone?
Well, communion, isn't it?
We did communion, right? Baptism, chrismation, Eucharist, ordination, marriage.
Confession that we did.
Confession. Thank you. See? I was forgetting. Yeah, so we'll just do unction. So we'll finish matrimony next week. We'll do unction, and then we'll have a class on funerals, which will be cool because I think it'll probably be a Memorial Saturday by that point or close to it. And we have a lot of those, so we do memorials and things like that. If you'd like to see what a memorial service looks like, if you didn't get the chance, on Wednesday night we had the Great Canon of St. Andrew, but we had a memorial, the full memorial service for one of our parishioners. And that's about a 25-minute service, half an hour. It's not the funeral, but it's got a lot of the parts of the funeral in it. If you'd like to see what that looks like and sounds like, it was a very nice service. But that's it for today. Any questions? Feel free to log off if you want. I'm happy to keep talking because I don't have to be anywhere.
Father, I was wondering if there are any norms or practices, particularly the Orthodox Church, relating to dating or engagement.
That's a great question. We'll talk more about engagement per se as a liturgical act because betrothal and crowning are actually, there's 2 rites in the marriage service. One is called betrothal and one is called crowning. And in some cases, people will make the betrothal the formal engagement and have it solemnized and then do the crowning as their wedding later. And sometimes that's split by like a year. Usually requires a permission to do it nowadays, but in many dioceses, it's normal practice. Many people obviously get engaged before they have the liturgical betrothal, and in most cases, the betrothal is done on the day of the wedding itself. But that's one thing. For dating, dating is again, the church wants to make sure that you're not rushing into an intimate relationship with someone before marriage because it's destructive to the soul. So when people say dating, I'm assuming that they mean just going out with each other and getting to know each other. Of course, that's fine. We would encourage that. We would not encourage you putting yourselves in a compromising position, saying, well, we really like each other. We want to snuggle, and then, well, it's late, and I don't want you to go, and then I have a warm bed, and why don't you come lay in bed with me, and we'll behave. These are not good things to do. This is not a good Christian example.
We like to use the term courting.
I like the idea of courting. Did you see The Patriot? I love that the bundling. That was my favorite.
That was a real practice.
That was a real. People would literally sew themselves into these bags. Their parents would sew them into bags so they couldn't get out. They could just like kiss. I'm not saying you should do that, but I'm saying is if you're gonna date somebody, to get to know them, keep it respectful, keep healthy boundaries. Don't get yourselves into positions where you're going to be in a position of heavy temptation. And you'll know in your conscience when you're crossing those lines. You're like, yeah, no, we should, if we're gonna be together in where we live, let's make sure we have roommates around or something, like somebody to hold us accountable. Somebody, so we're not going to totally just say, well, no one's around, no one's going to see, so let's go for it. It's a real dangerous temptation. Courting, though, is really is the next step in that, where you would say, I'd like to get to know you, and I'd like us to explore the possibility of if this relationship could be something that's really worth taking long term. So courting is like it's not engagement, but it's certainly entering into the exploratory phase of, is this a relationship we want to have? And the reason why not jumping into the sack early is so important is because when you jump into the sack with somebody, your endorphins and your hormones are intoxicating. You are like a drunk driver. Anybody who's been in love knows the truth of what I'm saying, all right? It should be scandalous because the feelings are intoxicating. And making love is an intoxicating experience just in itself, right? It's an incredible experience. You would do anything to keep that feeling going, right? You would be very easily overlook some major red flags in the person that you're dating if the sex is good. Let's be honest. And the point of going through this process, this patient process of courtship and refraining from premarital sex is so that you get to know the person how they actually are. Their personality, their values, their neuroses, their strengths, their weaknesses, all the things that make them tick as an actual human being and not just a body with all of its exciting toys.
And I think it's also patience and respect that dating, when you think about the traditional way that we know what
the hookup culture.
Yeah, because when you remove elements that in modern dating, it's done generally, if not on the first date, the second date. This really lets you know how you can practice that bed undefiled within your marriage. That's the key. That's how you do it. You preserve it, you nurture it, you honor it. And when you are dating someone who has patience and care, and you guys have both mutual respect for each other, you know both of you will be able to wait for that reward. Whereas if
think of it like an investment.
Yeah.
You know, you're taking all that energy that you could have just, used in the dissipation of the moment of the passion. And you're investing that energy into actually building a relationship with a person out of respect and out of honor and out of dignity. And you're saying, wow, I want to make a life with you. As long, your pipes probably work. Okay. Your machinery is probably going to do fine. All right. And you don't need to prove to the world that you're Casanova, right? That doesn't mean anything anymore. I mean, the most sleaziest people in the world are the people that are getting the most action. And what has it gotten them? It's pathetic. It's sad. It's like, when I was young, I was like, oh yeah, to be like them would be so like, that would be the thing, because that's what the music says, right? That's all the pop music was about. And still, oh God, I mean, if you know what happened at the Grammys, how terrible our conditions are. They haven't gotten better. As you get older, you realize that's not what makes a man a man. It's not what makes a woman a woman. It's what makes animals beasts and less than a beast. So put that energy into building a real relationship with a real human being. And I have to say, premarital sex rates have gone down in our country. You'd think that's good news. I don't know if it is. The reason is because people are having less relationships, though. They're plugging in more into pornography or more into the isolation of their devices.
Tinder.
And they're having less actual interactions with people. So there's less premarital sex because people are actually being less interactive with other human beings. So I don't know if it's actually a sign of a progress or a regress. I want it to go down, but not for that reason. I want it to go down because people are actually deciding to be more sober sexually. But it's not. It's not, unfortunately. We're living in a more sexually decadent time than ever in history. So, and I don't want to be the bedroom police. That's not my job as a priest. I'm not here to be the moral majority sex cop. I want you guys to have successful spiritual lives. And if that means being married and enjoying marriage, then I want you to know how to do that. And if that's how to be single.
And just from a practical point of view, as we get older, we get age, or let's say we become paralyzed, or we have some kind of chronic disease that hates us, that sometimes that's going to remove that part of that relationship. Does that mean you're going to love them less? Does that mean suddenly your marriage is diminished because that was really, in the end, what united you two?
A lot of men suffer, of course, it's a huge industry as they get older and they can't perform and they think like it's all over for them. Well, I mean, if you've kind of lived defining yourself by your passions, yeah, that's an absolute devastating thing for me. For me, it's if that happened to me, it hasn't happened to me, but if it did happen to me, yeah, my wife's embarrassed now. I wouldn't mind, honestly. I'd be like, oh, thank God. The Lord took something from me, but I know from talking to men who have suffered it, unfortunately doesn't take the spirit of lust. Sometimes it makes it more difficult for them because now they want to act out on it, and they can't. But the understanding that the purpose of that energy that is within us and rightly directing it is the key to really making peace with it and not letting it overcome your life. It should never define you as a person. That's why the Bible talks so much about it, because we obsess over it. It touches every part of our life sometimes, it seems like, and it's the thing that makes us feel so disconnected from God, because it can be such a selfish part of us. But it really shouldn't be. It doesn't have to be. I think the Lord showed us a way in which we could really have a meaningful way of living that part of our life.
But to go back to dating, we had this discussion with our high schoolers a couple of years ago when we brought in Subdeacon Eugene. And he made one good point about dating that was kind of in a more positive light. When you date for the right reasons, it's also to find out what you don't want.
Yeah.
What you don't want in a person. So sometimes, meeting someone and maybe going out to dinner, going out for coffee, having a group game night, whatever, you can kind of start working with personalities to kind of realize, this person has some personality traits. And it's also to test for yourself, again, when it's done intentionally and with chaste thoughts, of how good is your own radar in picking up red flags.
If you're pursuing the passion, you're going to hear that voice, but you're not going to pay attention to it. That voice that says, she's nice, but there's red flags, or he's nice, but whoa, danger. Those voices are going to be there. You need to listen to those voices. And if you're but I could get laid, all of a sudden those voices don't sound as convincing, or they're not as important. That's a huge mistake, because maybe you can avoid a long-term entanglement, but guess what? You fall into a deeper state of sin, or maybe there's a pregnancy, or maybe all of a sudden there's a disease, or whatever. There is so many consequences that come from the entanglement of that relationship with this when sex is involved, instead of just saying, what, I'm glad I got to know this person, but this is not the person that I want to be with. And if there's sex involved, making that decision becomes so complicated. It's like, I was good enough for the bed, but I'm not good enough to meet your parents. Whatever go from it wherever you want. But it becomes ugly, it becomes distorted, it becomes shameful. You carry it. You carry the burden of that the rest of your life, So dating with healthy boundaries, man. Oh my God.
And I think it's also very important to be surrounded by friend groups that encourage courting and chaste dating. I think that's one of the hardest pressures that any single person of any age. It's when you are not supported by friends who support you in choosing to date in a very chaste way, because they don't, and they want them, or they want you to be more like them to justify how they're sleeping around. So I think it's also very important, before you start dating, is make sure you have a really strong support system in encouraging you to do all the right things.
So that's a long answer to a short question. Any other questions? I'm glad you're all enjoying this and taking the time. Thank you for spending your afternoon with us. If not, we'll call it a day, and we'll see you next time. God bless you. Christ is among us.
He is now, shall be.
Thanks very much, Father.
Thank you.
Thank you.